My child, before this message reaches its end, something inside your heart may begin to change in ways you never expected. A mother's tears are never ignored in heaven, especially when they are shed for a child who has forgotten how to smile. Don't skip, because every word of this story carries hope, courage, and the reminder that even in complete silence, heaven still hears. Listen carefully. There was once a mother whose greatest pain was not poverty, sickness, or loneliness. Her greatest pain was watching her beloved son become completely silent. Day after day he walked through life without joy. His laughter had disappeared. His eyes no longer carried dreams. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, and even then, his voice sounded empty, as though a part of him had already given up. No one knew what had happened inside his heart. Friends assumed he simply wanted to be alone. Neighbors whispered that he had become cold and distant. Even relatives stopped asking questions because every answer was the same quiet nod. But his mother knew better. She knew silence like this was not ordinary. It was the silence of someone carrying a burden too heavy to explain. Every night, after her son fell asleep, she would kneel beside her bed. She would close her eyes, fold her trembling hands, and whisper the same prayer through tears. Heavenly Father, if my son cannot find the strength to speak, hear the words his heart cannot say. If darkness has surrounded him, please send your light. If he has forgotten hope, remind him that you have never forgotten him. Night after night, week after week, nothing seemed to change. Yet the mother refused to stop praying. She believed that heaven sometimes works quietly before miracles become visible. Then one night, something extraordinary happened. As the house rested in complete silence, a brilliant light filled the room where the mother prayed. It was not harsh. It was warm, peaceful, and unlike anything she had ever experienced. Standing within that heavenly light was Archangel Michael. His presence brought perfect peace instead of fear. His voice was calm, strong, and filled with compassion. He looked at the mother and gently said, "Do not lose heart. Every tear you have offered has been counted. Every prayer has reached heaven. Your son's silence is not the end of his story. I have been sent with a message of hope." The mother's tears flowed even more freely as she listened. Michael continued, "Your son believes he has been forgotten because he cannot see what heaven is preparing. But I tell you the truth, his greatest battle has also been preparing him for his greatest purpose. What looks like delay on earth has never been abandonment in heaven." The mother lowered her head in gratitude, unable to speak. Then Archangel Michael revealed something that changed everything. He must discover that his value has never depended on the opinions of people. The wounds he carries today will one day become the very reason others find healing through him. Do not force his journey. Continue loving him. Continue praying. Continue believing. The dawn is much closer than either of you can see. At that very moment, in another room, the silent son suddenly opened his eyes. He could not explain why. But for the first time in many months, he felt hope. The young man sat quietly on the edge of his bed, unable to understand why his heart suddenly felt different. Nothing around him had changed. The same walls surrounded him. The same silence filled the house. Yet somewhere deep within, a tiny spark had begun to glow. It was small, almost impossible to notice, but it was enough to keep him from returning to the hopelessness that had consumed him for so long. His mother noticed the difference the very next morning. As she placed breakfast on the table, her son looked at her for a brief moment before softly saying, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, yet to a mother who had waited through months of silence, those 2 words felt like heaven itself had answered her prayers. She smiled gently, hiding the tears gathering in her eyes. She chose not to ask questions. She remembered Archangel Michael's message: do not force his journey. Continue loving him. Continue believing. Throughout the day, the young man found himself remembering moments from his childhood, times when he laughed without fear, dreamed without limits, and believed that anything was possible. He wondered when that version of himself had disappeared. Had life slowly taken it away, or had he hidden it from the world because of disappointment, rejection, and broken expectations? That evening, while walking alone beneath the fading light of the sunset, he whispered a prayer for the first time in many months. Heaven, if you are truly listening, show me that I am not alone. The wind became still. The sky glowed with remarkable beauty. No loud voice echoed through the clouds, yet a deep peace settled over his heart, as though heaven had gently answered, "I have always been here." At that same moment, his mother knelt once again in prayer. "Father, thank you for giving me hope. Strengthen my son. Heal the places that no one else can see. Let him discover the purpose you have prepared for him." As she prayed, she remembered every word Archangel Michael had spoken. She realized that miracles are not always sudden. Sometimes they arrive one quiet step at a time. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not an instant change in circumstances, but the slow restoration of a weary heart. The following days were filled with small but meaningful moments. The son began spending a little more time outside. He started noticing the beauty of the morning sun, the songs of birds, and the kindness of strangers. These simple things had once seemed invisible to him, but now they reminded him that hope often returns through ordinary moments. Still, the battle inside him was not over. Some nights the old sadness returned, whispering that nothing would ever change. Some mornings fear tried to convince him that he would fail again. Yet each time those thoughts appeared, he remembered the unexplainable peace that had entered his heart after his quiet prayer. Instead of surrendering, he whispered, "If heaven has not given up on me, then I will not give up on myself." Far above, unseen by human eyes, Archangel Michael watched with quiet compassion. The journey ahead would still include challenges, but the greatest victory had already begun. The young man's heart, once locked in silence, had started opening again. And heaven knew that this was only the beginning of a far greater story. Days turned into weeks, and although the young man's life still looked ordinary from the outside, something extraordinary was quietly taking place within him. His heart, once buried beneath disappointment and fear, was slowly learning how to trust again. The silence that had once been filled with hopelessness was now becoming a place where gentle prayers began to grow. He did not have all the answers, and many questions still remained, but he no longer believed he had been abandoned. His mother continued praying every morning before the sun rose. She never demanded a miracle. She simply thanked God for every small sign of healing. One smile. One peaceful conversation. One moment of courage. She had learned that heaven often works through the smallest victories before revealing the greatest ones. One evening, after another quiet day, the young man stepped outside and looked toward the stars. "Father," he whispered, "I don't know what my future looks like. I don't know why this road has been so difficult. But if you still have a purpose for me, help me walk toward it." At that very moment, a calm breeze surrounded him. It felt different from any wind he had ever known, not powerful enough to frighten him, but gentle enough to remind him that he was not standing alone. That night, as he slept peacefully, he dreamed of standing on a mountain covered in brilliant light. Before him stood Archangel Michael, clothed in radiant splendor. There was no fear in the young man's heart, only peace unlike anything he had ever experienced. Michael looked at him with kindness and spoke clearly. "My child, you have believed that your silence made you weak. But heaven has seen every battle you fought when no one else noticed. Every tear you hid, every lonely night, every unanswered question. None of it was wasted." The young man listened with tears in his eyes. Archangel Michael continued, "Do not measure your life by the seasons of pain. Measure it by the faith that carried you through them. The enemy wanted your disappointment to become your identity, but heaven has called you by a different name. You are not forgotten. You are not defeated. You are being prepared." The young man lowered his head. "But why did I have to walk through so much darkness?" Michael answered with compassion. "Because there are people you will one day encourage who will only believe your words if they know you have survived the valley yourself. Compassion is often born in places where suffering once lived. One day your story will become someone else's reason to keep believing." As those words echoed through the mountain, the young man saw countless lights appearing across the horizon. Each light represented a life that would one day be touched by hope, kindness, forgiveness, and faith. Michael raised his hand toward the glowing horizon. "You cannot yet see the full picture, but heaven already can. Continue walking one faithful step at a time. Do not rush what God is carefully building. Trust His timing even when you cannot understand His plan." When the young man awoke before dawn, tears filled his eyes, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of hope. For the first time in years, he opened the family Bible resting quietly on a nearby table. He read slowly, allowing every word to settle into his heart. His mother walked past the doorway, saw him reading, and quietly thanked God without interrupting him. She knew that this moment had not been created by human effort. It had grown from countless prayers planted in faith. Neither of them realized that an even greater miracle was drawing near. The message from Archangel Michael had only begun to unfold, and heaven was preparing a meeting that would change not only the young man's future, but also the lives of many people around him. The weeks that followed became unlike anything the young man had experienced before. His circumstances had not suddenly become perfect, yet his heart was no longer controlled by fear. Each morning he awoke with a quiet determination to take one more faithful step, trusting that God was leading him even when he could not see the entire path. His mother continued to pray, but now her prayers sounded different. They were no longer filled only with tears of sorrow. They were filled with gratitude. "Father, thank you for never giving up on my son. Continue the work you have begun in him. Let his life become a testimony of your faithfulness." One afternoon, the young man decided to visit a small hill outside the town where he often sat alone during his darkest days. It was the place where he had once believed his future was over. As he stood there again, he realized how much had changed within him. The same hill, the same sky, the same quiet wind, but a completely different heart. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." In that peaceful moment, he remembered every painful season he had survived. The rejection, the disappointment, the unanswered prayers, the loneliness that had once seemed endless. Looking back, he could now see something he had never noticed before: God had never left him. Even in the moments when he felt abandoned, heaven had been quietly protecting him. As the sun began to set, a familiar warmth surrounded him once again. Though invisible to human eyes, the presence of Archangel Michael filled the place with peace. A gentle voice spoke within his heart. "Do not fear the future. The strength you asked heaven for has already been growing inside you. Every trial has shaped your character. Every delay has strengthened your faith. What once looked like a prison has become preparation." The young man listened carefully. Michael continued, "There are many who appear strong on the outside but are broken within. Because you have walked through suffering, you will recognize their pain. You will speak hope where others speak fear. You will remind the weary that God never abandons those who trust Him." As those words settled into his heart, the young man understood something he had never fully realized before. His greatest purpose was not simply to receive healing. It was to become a source of encouragement for others who were silently carrying heavy burdens. When he returned home that evening, his mother immediately noticed a peaceful confidence in his eyes. They sat together at the dinner table, and for the first time in a very long time, they shared a heartfelt conversation. "I don't know exactly what God has planned," the young man said softly, "but I know now that my life still has meaning." His mother's eyes filled with tears of joy. "I prayed for this day," she replied. "Not because I wanted your problems to disappear overnight, but because I wanted you to know that heaven has always loved you." They embraced, both overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, before going to sleep, the young man knelt beside his bed. "Father," he prayed, "if my story can help even one person find hope again, then let my life be used for your glory. Guide my steps, and help me remain faithful wherever you lead." As his prayer ended, a deep peace filled the room. Far above, Archangel Michael looked upon the family with quiet joy. The mother's faithful prayers had opened the door for healing, but heaven's work was not finished yet. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would reveal why the young man's long season of silence had been allowed, and how God would transform his greatest pain into a blessing for countless others. Several months passed, and the quiet transformation that had begun inside the young man became visible to everyone around him. The people who once believed he would never smile again were surprised by the gentle peace that now rested on his face. He was not loud. He was not seeking attention. But there was a calm confidence within him that could not be explained by human strength alone. His mother often watched him from a distance with grateful eyes. She remembered the nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering if her son would ever find hope again. Now she realized that every prayer had been building something she could not see at the time. Heaven had been working long before the answers became visible. One afternoon, while helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries, the young man noticed another young man sitting alone on a nearby bench. His shoulders were bent with discouragement, and his eyes reflected the same emptiness that he himself had once carried. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he remembered the words Archangel Michael had spoken in his dream. "One day your story will become someone else's reason to keep believing." He quietly walked over and sat beside the stranger. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Sometimes silence understands silence better than words ever can. Finally, the stranger whispered, "I don't think anyone notices me anymore." Those simple words touched the deepest part of the young man's heart. He answered softly, "I used to believe the same thing." The stranger looked at him with surprise. "What changed?" The young man smiled gently. "I discovered that God's silence is never his absence. Sometimes he is doing his greatest work where we can see the least." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. The young man did not pretend to have every answer. He simply shared his own journey, his fears, his loneliness, the prayers of his faithful mother, and the hope that slowly returned to his heart. When they finally stood to leave, the stranger's eyes looked different. The burden had not completely disappeared, but hope had returned. Watching from her kitchen window, the young man's mother quietly thanked God once again. She realized that this was exactly what Archangel Michael had promised. The wounds her son had carried were becoming bridges that helped others find healing. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table with joy they had not experienced in years. There was laughter once again. There were stories. There was gratitude. The mother looked at her son and said, "There was a time when I prayed only for your healing. Now I pray that God continues using your life to bring hope wherever you go." The young man reached across the table and held his mother's hand. "If you had stopped praying," he said quietly, "I don't know where I would be today." His mother's eyes filled with tears. "I never stopped because heaven never gave me permission to give up." Those words stayed in his heart long after the meal had ended. Later that night, as he stepped outside beneath the stars, he whispered another prayer. "Father, thank you for sending hope when I believed there was none. Thank you for hearing the prayers my mother prayed when I could not even pray for myself. Keep my heart humble, and help me remember that every blessing comes from you." A gentle breeze moved through the trees. It reminded him of the first night everything had begun to change. Though he could no longer see the vision from his dream, he felt the same peace surrounding him. Far above, Archangel Michael continued watching over the journey that heaven had carefully prepared, not because the young man would never face another trial, but because he would never have to face one alone. The story of healing was still unfolding. And heaven was preparing one final message that would reveal the deeper purpose behind every prayer, every tear, and every moment of silence the mother had faithfully carried before God. The following morning arrived with a gentle peace that neither the mother nor her son could fully explain. The house was still simple. The circumstances had not magically changed overnight. Bills still needed to be paid. Questions about the future still remained. Yet something far more valuable had changed: the atmosphere of their hearts. Fear no longer ruled the home. Hope had quietly taken its place. The young man rose before sunrise and stepped outside. The cool morning air reminded him of the countless mornings when he had once stood in the same place feeling empty and defeated. Back then he had believed that every new day would simply repeat the pain of the one before it. But now, even though he still didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he believed that God was already there waiting for him. He closed his eyes and prayed. "Father, thank you for giving me another day. Teach me to trust you even when I cannot understand your plans. Help me become a blessing to someone who feels as lost as I once did." As he finished praying, an overwhelming peace settled over his heart. It was the same peaceful presence that had first entered his life after his mother's faithful prayers. Inside the house, his mother quietly opened the old notebook where she had written prayer after prayer throughout the hardest years of her son's life. Some pages were stained with tears. Some contained only a few trembling words. Others were filled with long prayers asking heaven to protect her son from despair. She slowly turned each page. Then she smiled. Every painful memory had become evidence of God's faithfulness. Every unanswered season had been preparing an answered future. She whispered softly, "Father, you heard every prayer, even when I thought you were silent." Later that afternoon, the young man visited a local park where many people gathered. As he sat quietly beneath a large tree, an elderly man slowly walked toward him. Without introducing himself, the man sat beside him and sighed deeply. "I've been carrying something in my heart for years," the stranger said. "I don't know why. But I feel like I was supposed to sit here today." The young man listened without interrupting. The elderly man shared stories of regret, disappointment, broken relationships, and years of feeling forgotten. When he finally finished speaking, tears filled his eyes. "I don't think anyone understands," the young man gently replied. "I understand more than you know." He shared a small part of his own journey, not to draw attention to himself, but to remind the stranger that healing was possible. He spoke about the faithful love of his mother. He spoke about learning to trust God again. He spoke about discovering that heaven had never abandoned him, even during the darkest nights. The elderly man remained silent for several moments. Then he quietly said, "Today you gave me hope." As those words were spoken, the young man remembered Archangel Michael's promise. "Your story will become light for people walking through darkness." He realized the promise was already being fulfilled. He didn't need a stage. He didn't need recognition. He only needed a willing heart. That evening, when he returned home, his mother noticed the peaceful smile on his face. "You encouraged someone today, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded. "I think God allowed me to experience pain so I could recognize it in others." His mother gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "That is how heaven often works," she said. "The comfort we receive becomes the comfort we share." As night covered the sky, both mother and son knelt together in prayer. Neither of them asked for wealth. Neither of them prayed for fame. They simply thanked God for His faithfulness. Far above, Archangel Michael watched with quiet joy. The mother's prayers had done far more than rescue one broken heart. They had begun a chain of hope that would continue reaching lives the family had never even met. And although they could not yet see it, heaven was preparing one final revelation that would bring the entire journey to its beautiful conclusion. Several more weeks passed, and the quiet work God had begun in the young man's heart continued to grow stronger. He no longer measured his life by what he had lost. Instead, he thanked God each evening for the strength to keep moving forward. The scars of his past had not disappeared, but they no longer controlled his future. They had become reminders that God's grace is greater than every painful chapter. His mother often watched him from the kitchen window as he greeted neighbors with kindness, helped elderly people carry heavy bags, and patiently listened to anyone who needed encouragement. There had been a time when she wondered if her son would ever smile again. Now she saw him bringing hope to people she had never met. One evening she quietly asked him, "My son, what changed your heart so completely?" He smiled gently before answering. "I finally realized that God was never writing the end of my story. He was simply writing a chapter one couldn't understand." Those words filled the mother's eyes with grateful tears. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, she knelt beside her bed once again. But this prayer was different from all the prayers she had prayed before. "Heavenly Father, thank you. I once asked you to remove my son's pain. Instead, you transformed it into purpose. I asked you to rescue him from darkness. Instead, you taught him how to carry your light into the darkness of others. Your wisdom was greater than my understanding." As she finished praying, an extraordinary peace filled the room. In her heart she sensed the familiar presence she had experienced months earlier. Though she saw no visible figure, she remembered the comforting words of Archangel Michael. "Faithful prayers are never forgotten in heaven. Love offered with patience always bears fruit in God's perfect time." The next morning, something unexpected happened. A young mother arrived at their home with her teenage son. The boy had barely spoken for months and refused to leave his room. Through a friend, she had heard about the quiet transformation of this family and simply asked, "Would your son be willing to speak with mine?" The young man welcomed them with kindness. He did not begin with advice. He did not preach. He simply sat beside the teenager in silence. After several minutes he quietly said, "You don't have to explain everything today. Just know that you don't have to carry it alone." The teenager slowly lifted his head. For the first time in many weeks, someone had understood his silence instead of judging it. They talked for a long time. The young man shared only enough of his own story to remind the boy that despair does not have to become destiny. Before leaving, the teenager whispered, "Thank you. I think I want to keep trying." His mother broke into tears of relief. After they left, the young man stood quietly outside, looking toward the evening sky. He remembered the day he had asked heaven if anyone was listening. Now he realized that God had answered not only by healing his heart, but by allowing his journey to become hope for others. Inside the house, his own mother opened her Bible and smiled. She understood something she had never fully seen before. Every prayer she had prayed in secret had reached far beyond her own family. The blessing God had given her son was already touching other homes, other parents, and other broken hearts. Far above, Archangel Michael watched with quiet joy. The mission heaven had prepared was unfolding exactly as God intended. Yet one final chapter still remained. Soon, the mother and her son would receive one last reminder that no sincere prayer, no hidden tear, and no act of faithful love is ever forgotten before the throne of God. Months had passed since the night the mother's desperate prayer had reached heaven in a way she could never have imagined. Looking back, she could now see a beautiful pattern that had been invisible while she was living through the pain. Every delayed answer had strengthened her faith. Every sleepless night had drawn her closer to God. Every tear she had shed had become a silent testimony that love never gives up. The young man's life continued to touch people in unexpected ways. He never considered himself extraordinary. He simply remembered what it felt like to be broken, and because he remembered, he treated every hurting person with compassion. Whether speaking to a lonely neighbor, encouraging a discouraged friend, or quietly praying with someone who had almost lost hope, he carried himself with humility. One afternoon, as he returned from visiting an elderly couple, he found his mother sitting quietly with the old prayer journal resting on her lap. She smiled as he approached. "There is something I want to show you." She carefully opened the journal to its very first page. The handwriting was unsteady, written during one of the darkest nights of her life. The prayer simply said, "Father, even if I never understand your plan, I choose to trust your heart. Please don't let my son lose the purpose you created him for." The young man read those words slowly. His eyes filled with tears. He looked at his mother and whispered, "You were praying for me when I didn't even have the strength to pray for myself." She gently nodded. A mother's faith often keeps believing until her child can believe again. For several moments neither of them spoke. Their silence no longer carried sorrow. It carried gratitude. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, they walked together through a nearby field. The air was calm, and the sky glowed with colors that reminded them of God's faithfulness. The young man suddenly stopped walking. "I used to ask God why He allowed so much pain." He looked toward the heavens. "Now I ask Him to help me never waste what He taught me through it." His mother smiled. That is the prayer of a healed heart. As darkness settled across the land, a familiar peace surrounded them. Though invisible to human eyes, they both sensed the comforting assurance that had guided them since the beginning of their journey. In the quietness of that moment, the words of Archangel Michael seemed to echo once more within their hearts. "Do not be afraid of the seasons you cannot understand. God is never absent from the lives of those who trust Him. Every faithful prayer is remembered. Every act of love is recorded. Every tear offered in faith will one day become part of a testimony that brings hope to others." The young man closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Father, for answering my mother's prayers in ways we never expected." They returned home with peaceful hearts, unaware that the greatest encouragement was still ahead. Heaven had one final reminder prepared, not only for them, but for everyone who would one day hear their story. The journey that began with a mother's tears was about to end with a testimony that would inspire countless hearts to keep praying, keep believing, and never lose hope. Even when heaven seems silent, the seasons continued to change, but one truth remained constant: the faithfulness of God had never failed. The little home that had once echoed with sorrow was now filled with quiet gratitude. The mother often looked around the room and remembered the nights when she had prayed with trembling hands, wondering if heaven had heard even a single word. Now she understood that God had been listening from the very beginning. One morning, the young man found the old prayer journal resting on the table. Slowly, he turned each page, reading the prayers his mother had written through the years. Some pages simply said, "Lord, protect my son today." Others were filled with heartfelt cries asking God to heal the wounds no one else could see. By the time he reached the final page, tears were streaming down his face. He closed the journal, walked to his mother, and embraced her. "I never knew how much you carried for me." His mother smiled through her tears. A mother's love doesn't count the cost. It simply keeps praying. The young man replied softly. And heaven never ignored those prayers. That evening, they invited several neighbors into their home for a simple time of thanksgiving. There was no grand celebration, no impressive decorations, only grateful hearts gathered together. People shared stories of how hope had returned to their own lives after meeting the young man. Some spoke about restored relationships. Others shared how they had found the courage to pray again after years of giving up. The young man listened quietly. He knew those stories were never about him. They were about God's mercy working through an ordinary life surrendered to Him. As the evening came to an end, everyone joined hands in prayer. The young man prayed, "Father, thank you for hearing the prayers spoken through tears. Thank you for sending hope when we could not see tomorrow. Teach us to become answers to someone else's prayers, just as you answered ours." A deep peace filled the room. No one saw the unseen world surrounding them. But heaven rejoiced. For another family had discovered that faith is never wasted. That same night, as the mother prepared to rest, she opened her Bible one last time before sleeping. She whispered, "Lord, if another mother somewhere is crying for her child tonight, remind her not to stop praying. Remind her that your timing is always perfect." She closed the Bible with a peaceful smile. Far above, Archangel Michael looked upon the family with quiet joy. The mission that had begun with one desperate prayer had now become a testimony of hope reaching many lives. The mother's tears had become songs of gratitude. The son's silence had become words of encouragement. And the message heaven sent had continued spreading far beyond the walls of their home. Yet there remained one final chapter. One final message. One final reminder that would reveal the greatest lesson of all, that no sincere prayer is ever forgotten, no faithful heart is ever abandoned, and no life surrendered to God is ever without purpose. The following weeks became a living testimony of everything heaven had promised from the very beginning. The little home that had once been filled with silent tears was now filled with quiet joy. Nothing about the family was perfect. Life still brought challenges, unexpected difficulties, and moments that required faith. But there was one difference that changed everything. They no longer walked through those moments believing they were alone. The young man continued serving others with humility. Every conversation reminded him of the dark season God had carried him through. Every person who shared their pain reminded him that countless hearts were fighting battles no one else could see. Instead of asking why suffering existed, he now prayed for wisdom to become a light wherever God placed him. One evening, as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, the young man and his mother returned to the place where so many prayers had first been whispered. They stood together in complete silence, remembering the journey that had brought them there. The mother gently smiled. "I used to come here asking heaven to change your life." Her son looked at her with grateful eyes. "And heaven changed both of ours." They embraced, thanking God for every answered prayer, every delayed answer, and even every painful season that had taught them to trust Him more deeply. Don't skip. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that God removes every storm from our lives. The greatest miracle is discovering that He never leaves us while we walk through them. As night covered the sky, an overwhelming peace surrounded them once again. The young man closed his eyes. Without seeing anything with his natural eyes, he sensed the same heavenly comfort that had first touched his heart months earlier. Deep within his spirit came the gentle reminder of Archangel Michael's message. The prayers offered in faith are never forgotten. The tears shed in love are never wasted. Heaven's timing is perfect, even when earth cannot understand it. Those words settled into his heart forever. He finally understood why his mother had never stopped praying. She had trusted God's character even when she could not understand His plan. That faith had become the foundation upon which heaven rebuilt an entire life. Months later, people from nearby towns continued visiting the young man. Some came searching for encouragement. Others simply needed someone who would listen without judging them. Whenever they asked him how he had found hope again, he never pointed to himself. He always smiled and answered. It began with a mother who refused to stop praying, and with a God who never stopped listening. His mother would quietly lower her head in gratitude whenever she heard those words. She knew the true hero of the story had never been her faith alone. It had always been God's unfailing mercy. Don't skip. If you ever feel that heaven has become silent, remember this family's journey. Silence does not mean God has abandoned you. Very often, silence is where His greatest work begins. Years later, the old prayer journal remained safely kept inside their home. Its pages had faded. The ink had grown lighter. But every prayer written there had become living proof that faith planted in tears can one day produce a harvest of hope. Whenever the young man opened that journal, he would gently smile and whisper, "Thank you, Father, for hearing every prayer my mother prayed when I had no strength left to pray for myself." The mother would quietly respond, "And thank you for proving that no child is ever beyond the reach of God's love." As the stars filled the heavens above them, both mother and son bowed their heads one final time. "Heavenly Father," they prayed together, "thank you for your faithfulness through every season. Teach us to keep trusting you when answers seem delayed, to keep loving when life becomes difficult, and to keep praying for others with the same hope you gave us. May our lives always point people toward your goodness and your peace. A gentle breeze moved across the field. Their hearts were completely at rest. The story that had begun with tears had ended with unwavering hope. The silence that once brought sorrow had become a testimony of God's presence. The mother's faithful prayers had reached heaven. Archangel Michael's message had reminded them that God's promises never fail. And their lives became a lasting witness that no prayer spoken in faith, no act of patient love, and no heart surrendered to God is ever forgotten. The greatest miracle was never simply that the son found his voice again. The greatest miracle was that an entire family discovered, beyond every doubt, that heaven had been walking beside them all along.